Hey guys, it's Runchuks from Love the Spot. Bryan Pellegrino joined me this week. Some of you might know him by his online screen name PrimordialAA. He achieved a lot of success as a professional poker player, and after his best year where he scored $1 million in EV, he went for a 1-year long trip around the world with his wife and kid. He's self-described as an obsessive person when it comes to work. He firmly believes that if you dive fully into something and work hard, you can achieve almost anything you want. Bryan founded several successful startups, sold one of his products to a couple Major League Baseball teams, and he's currently very active in the fields of AI and cryptocurrencies. He also was one of the people who started publicly paying attention to COVID-19 virus early on and has been very active on Twitter, giving us regular updates on the topic. So this was a wide-ranging conversation. There's so much we can learn from Bryan. I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, the timestamps are in the description so you can jump around. Enjoy! And we're live. Bryan, so glad to have you on the show.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I don't even know where to start. I wanna say that, well, first of all, when I think about what kind of things we can talk about today, things that come to mind are you've been so successful in poker. Now you've transitioned to business. And you've been even transitioning while you were still playing poker. You famously were investing in some ideas while being a poker player, so that there's a wealth of information we can talk about there, and so many lessons I'm sure that we can learn from. And now with the current situation of the virus and the lockdowns, etc., etc., I saw that you were one of the, let's say, early whatever word I'm searching for. You were one of the first people actually talking about COVID situation publicly on Twitter, and you're keeping an eye out on the statistics all the time, and you update people, and you've made. I read your article on Medium, and you're just very active in that. So there are so many things we can talk about. And let's start actually with how did it come about that you started being so public about the COVID?
Yeah, to be honest, this is not something I planned at all. I was just going about my life as usual, and I just started seeing, a lot of people talking about it. Kind of early to mid January, you had people talking about this thing happening over in China, and nobody was really paying a ton of attention to it, but even then, I saw some people sort of calling for extremes about it. And then you went on kind of mid to late January, early February. And that's when I convinced myself, I guess, that it was going to be, that it had the chance to be, not was going to be, had the chance to be fairly serious. Um, you had China starting to take things more drastically, considering lockdown. It just seemed like there were measures being taken that didn't make any sense if it wasn't something that was going to be fairly serious. Like, you don't just lock down a city of tens of millions of people on a whim. And then you started to see, okay, now these other outbreaks are like starting to happen. Iran started blowing up, and still people weren't they weren't taking it again super seriously at all. So I just you do a little bit of research. It's easy once you see the initial R naughts come out of around 2.5 to see, like, okay, 2.5 can be pretty insane. Like any exponential modeling that you do, it just shows how crazy that can be in a very very short period of time. Um, and yeah, it started blowing up. I live in a place that happens to have extremely high throughput, both to China and Iran, basically. So a lot of the families in our school, a lot of people in our neighborhood go back there quite often for work, for family, for all of those things. And so, I was at, back then we didn't have really any demographic data. I think maybe there were the first kind of inklings of, like, oh, it only seems to be affecting old people, but it was like very, very early numbers only out of China. And so I pulled my kid out of school. We're talking, like, I think this is week 9 of quarantine for us. Yeah, so something like that. So he maybe he was pulled out of school just after that, but yeah, he was pulled out of school quite early. Maybe it's, yeah, I don't know. I'll have to go back and check, but right 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks before spring break, basically, we started cycling like a common flu in the house, and I just kind of used that as an excuse to keep him out. We're just like, we're sick, we're taking precautions, etc. And then situation kept progressing, going on from that. But in terms of the Medium articles and the stats, I just, it was frustrating for me watching people think about this in what I consider to be the wrong way. So really, it's just my propensity for wanting to argue with people on the internet that really drew me into it. But I just kept seeing people talk about CFR. It was a big one that really got me, as if it was this absolute. And so the example I always give is, 100 people get sick, 3 people die, 5 people recover, and 92 people are still sick. And they're like, oh, the CFR is 3%. They say it in terms of like this absolute. CFR is made to be this thing at kind of the end of an epidemic where you're talking about, okay, how many deaths were there relative to the number of people who were infected? And people just kept taking in terms of absolute and not at all considering the 92% of people who were still infected from that cohort. It's like, okay, well, if it's only 3%, if everybody in that cohort still recovers 100%, which just seemed really unlikely at the time. And so, there's a ton of things to weigh. There's a bunch of arguments. So you have to, right now we only have confirmed cases. We don't have the true number of infections. Later on, once you can test for antibodies or do these other things, you can get some sort of sampling of what we think the actual infection rate was. So really, CFR is like, it's not a great measure right now, but still you want some way to sort of measure lethality. But yeah, so basically, I was just frustrated with how people were doing it. I just said that I'm going to start running the numbers very publicly, just updating them every day, and everybody can just kind of gauge for themselves. And when I started doing it, the CFR from the sort of sample of 12 countries that I was taking from was like 1.8% or something. And everyone was like, no, it's the true CFR is 0.1% or less. This will absolutely go down. Everybody was really, really not everybody, a large majority of people were very persistent on that. And now I think we're at like 6.35% for that same cohort of countries. So it's just gotten progressively worse. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking, whenever I see somebody make or take steps like you did, you said week 9 of the quarantine, right? So you pull your kid out, take all the other precautions. Considering that in our lifetime we don't have an experience we can fall back on, I was saying like, oh, you know what? This thing might be like this other thing that we experienced. Basically, nobody who's alive today, or almost nobody, experienced a thing like this, right? In a peacetime where you're actually so restricted and so many things are happening that we could not have predicted. So to take these early measures, I find it fascinating, that some people just go ahead and say, well, I don't need the proof that this can be fucking horrible. I just assess a risk and I take the measures that I believe are necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the big thing, right? Is like, I mean, anybody who's been in poker or gambling or investing in general, all of that, like you just deal with a huge amount of uncertainty. And that's another thing that's consistently frustrating with much of the rest of the world and politicians and, sort of the way that countries operate is everybody wants perfect information. It's like, yeah, of course, we would all love to have perfect information all of the time. But at the end of the day, you just don't have it and you can't wait to get perfect or even like almost perfect information before you can act on things. We have to deal in environments of large amounts of uncertainty with very limited information often, and you have to be able to make a decision. And yeah, I mean, I think it just comes down to that is it was, and granted, it's easier for me as an individual to act than it is for like a country, but I still think, the difference is the people and the positions who are sort of making the larger decisions they again, I would be totally fine if they took the rational argument of like, here's what we know, it could go here. We understand that this is not an absolute, and like we need to make a decision, and we're waiting for whatever. But everyone was just like, oh well, look at this one point in time, and that's what it is. So it's it's less bad than the flu, or it's only killed this many people, or this is where it is, and nobody has any, it feels like, ability to like project off into the future and say, okay, well, here's a set of assumptions, here are like some different outcomes, which of these are bad, and what percentages of that is bad. And I think one of the things that people fail to consider is, you know I don't, at the time, early on, I thought it was going to be, and it's weird now because part of me feels like this outcome is less bad maybe than it I thought that it would be, in that, okay, a bunch of people are dying. You have over 1 million people, almost 1.5 million, who've been infected. The whole world's locked down. Like that's a pretty bad outcome in terms of everybody's just sitting indoors and a bunch of people have died. Like clearly that's not sustainable long term. But originally I thought the CFR would be maybe 0.5%, something more in that range. But I knew that the worst case scenario is that the CFR is closer to like 5 or 10%, in which case it's just like insane and everybody should be inside it literally until we have a vaccine. Like if we had 10% or something with an R naught of 2.5. And so I just think that people aren't able to look at the worst case, or at least measure for it. Like even if the 0.5 CFR was the most likely scenario at the time, or 0.2 CFR, like let's say that happens 50% of the time. If like 5 to 10% of the time the CFR is 5% plus and the R naught stays 2.5, like are we really just going to torch like 3% of the total global population? It's just insane. So for me, the scenario was spring break's coming up, like a couple weeks prior to spring break. I can either give my kid this extra couple weeks of exposure and take all of that risk, or like just hold them out for a couple weeks, go through spring break and see where we are from 5 weeks from now, right? So it's like not that drastic of a measure to miss a couple weeks of school and get like a huge amount of information. So yeah, I don't know. The big thing to me is I think anybody, and again, a lot of poker players, I feel like we're quite early to this. A lot of people in the Valley are investing in general. I know Balaji is like very famously on this quite early. Um, I just think anybody who deals again in environments with risk, high amounts of risk and lots of uncertainty, are able to sort of at least analyze this enough. Like anybody who spent time looking at it should have come away with, this is something we should pay attention to, and there's enough risk in it that we should consider taking measures early. And again, I think most of the people in those professions were on top of it much earlier than the average person.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It does seem that way, especially with the public figures in the crypto field and in the Valley. Balaji, like you've mentioned, I mean, he's been so, like, pretty much from day one. He was there talking
Yep.
about it, and one of the points he was making, which he also voiced, is that it's crazy how the other governments and so many people just ignored the fact that China, being China, just closed down the country. They took that measure, and people still in the governments in the West kept saying, like, well, it's just the flu, nothing to worry about. Really, do you really think a country like China is gonna overreact to such an extent just because it's a flu? Right?
Yep.
And another thing, with all the risk assessments, etc., and all the R naught and CFR and all the other statistics that you've been mentioning, another aspect that people are sort of ignoring is that it's a new disease and you don't even know the long-term effects or side effects that it might have, right? And we are just assuming that as soon as you're fine, sort of as soon as you're testing negative now, you don't have any other effects. In fact, there's no research into that yet, any conclusive at least. So, taking that risk doesn't seem that smart. And
Yeah, and fortunately, we're in a position where it's quite easy for us to just, my many of my family members, my sisters, my brothers, and stuff, they have less of a luxury. One of my sister, a nurse in a hospital. Another brother-in-law is an EMT. Her sister-in-law is a nurse in a hospital. Brother-in-law is an EMT. My sister works at a school that wasn't shut. Like, they're worried about losing their jobs, or there's just a lot of functions that people don't have the luxury. But for anybody who's able to work from home, like, I guess I'll just say it's easy for us to say that and to do that. And it's less easy for other people. So I get that it's harder and it's more of a sacrifice. I come from a very small place, and many of the people there are like, weren't taking it seriously very on, or like, what are they going to do? It's their only source of income. It's their job. Their job is still open. There's like 15 cases in the state of a million. Um, I don't know. It's just tough. But yeah, we have the luxury, and I think for people like us in biology and people who work from home, anybody who works with information, it's much easier to do for sure.
Absolutely, yeah, and also just by the design, a lot of people who have a conventional job, they don't work with having to make these decisions. They don't work with having to make risk assessments. So for them to all of a sudden do that, it would actually be surprising, and we would be, probably thinking like, what the hell? How did you guys know about this? Or how did you come to this conclusion? Especially, when the media seem to be voicing opinion that, hey, there's nothing to worry about. Some of the government officials were clearly sending the wrong signal early on and just downplaying the whole thing. So yeah, and like you said, for people to make a decision of, okay, I'm going to distance myself, etc., etc., when you have a job and your boss doesn't buy into your arguments, it's pretty tough, because you basically have to say, okay, I quit. I want to save my life and the life of, possibly a lot of other people, so I'm going to quit. Well, not that easy.
Yep, definitely not that easy, especially not if you have, dependents, a family, people you're trying to support. It's just not a practical decision for many to take, which is,
Right.
why I guess we have governments and sort of societies to enforce some of these things. And it,
Mm.
it came late, but at least now, it's being enforced by more people, by, I guess, more places.
Yeah. And I'm just smiling because my son tried to break into the room and probably wants to participate in the conversation. But
You'll likely see mine come in here at,
all
at
right,
least
awesome,
once.
awesome,
They roam through quite often.
yeah. So Brian, yeah, one thing I wanna kind of something that caught my attention lately is that, for example, these things of not assessing the risks, these things of not analyzing or having to make decisions based on some information and analysis of it, goes to show that maybe, there's clear deficiency in educational system that we have, because people are just not used to it. And also the media is pretty exposed as, I see so many journalists, for the longest time already, make sensationalist claims without having to pay the consequences. Because if they're right, then they just get all the, kisses on the ass, and they just are the geniuses, and they deserve to be, promoted and whatnot. If they're wrong, there's not much backlash usually, because people tend to forget. Whereas this specific situation really exposed deficiencies in, how people analyze information, and also exposed deficiencies of the media. And at the same time, what it brings out is people like you, who took it upon themselves to spread the information and to basically play the role of a journalist, trying to get objective sources of information, trying to analyze the data and putting it out there. So to me, it seems that, while the situation exposes some deficiencies, it also opens up opportunities for the future for, some people to potentially make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly any sort of strain on a system like this is going to is going to show cracks, right? And it's fine, whether it's the financial system, whether it's the education system, journalism, all of that. I think we see now. Well, it depends, but hopefully people are starting to see a little bit more. I certainly don't, don't think of myself as trying to fill the role of a journalist, but I do often think of sort of just like incentives, right? So even myself, right? You have this sort of you're posting something, you got a lot of people, it's classic social media where you have this this sort of like dopamine hit you're getting when you're getting positive reactions, and I have to constantly force myself to sort of evaluate, like, do you actually still believe, do you actually still take this stance as strongly as you did a week ago or before, right? Are you only taking the stance because um, you know basically that's what you took before and you had this positive feedback cycle of like people sort of liking this stuff, or do you still really believe that? So I try to like reaffirm those beliefs as often as I can, and really focus on like looking back at the data and like, okay, what do I see the trajectory currently at? Where does it look? Not just like emotionally, like, okay, I held this belief a week or two ago, and I'm just going to keep going on until it's wrong because it will get me, likes or clicks or whatever it may be. But in journalism and many of these other things, like, you just have to look at incentives. At the end of the day, like, if my job was how can I generate as many views or clicks on this thing, like, I'm certainly not going to be sitting there writing like well thought out, unbiased articles, right? You're going to take the most sensationalist thing, you're going to cherry pick certain pieces of data, and maybe because there's negative incentives to like you don't want to get exposed of having grab something that was truly false, but you're still going to cherry pick kind of like the headline of an academic study or one specific line in an academic study versus like what it actually says later on. And you're basically, the entire system of that is designed just to feed this advertising engine. And yeah, the incentives are just so poor. There's no incentives or very few for quality reporting for most of this stuff. Most of it is about generating generating views for advertisements. And at the end of the day, like, it's very clear to see that's not like well thought out objective truth of things. And so, I personally have never ever given mainstream media much attention because I try to actually think about those things, but many people do. So I'm hoping that this opens their eyes at least a little bit to that. Like, but that's how you should think about anything in life, is what all of the actors that you have going on here, like, what are their incentives? What drives them? Where do they get most of their gain from? And even if you don't think they're like intentionally a bad actor, you have to understand that naturally they're going to focus more of those efforts in that direction. You see it all the time in a million different things. Education too will be very interesting. I've been a huge proponent of online education for a very long time. I think I was like one of the first people signed up to Udacity, and following, Coursera, Khan Academy, all of these things for like 10 plus years or something, just forever. Always thought it was going to be huge. I actually thought it would have been much bigger than it was by now. But maybe this is a positive transition. But at the same time, I've seen just how lacking it can be. Right, my kid's school is back in session now, but not physically, and you have the teacher doing doing remote classes with the remote calls with the class of 20 kindergarteners twice a day. They're only like 30-minute calls, but that, the kids have all figured out how to mute and unmute themselves. So that's like a good step, but it's still like, it's chaos. It's not the same feeling. And then the rest of their day is like tasks on an iPad or needing their parents to go through and do these lessons with them, which is great. Now we're all quarantined. I work with my kid a ton anyways, so we're totally used to doing that things. But like, once people go back to jobs in real life, I have no clue how the average family would ever do that. Like, it's just not an all encompassing like educational experience. There's a huge amount lacking in terms of like what the kid gets at school relative. Like right now, they're just going through a couple of tasks, but even that, it takes a very large amount of manual intervention of setting these things up and doing it. And so there's just so much, at least for that age group of early education, where it's an okay augmentation, but we still don't have that full education experience. And most of the most other than Khan Academy, I will say, which has stayed pretty pure as a nonprofit. Most of the others, Coursera, Udacity, etc., all of these things have gone into again, you just look at incentives. They've gone away from free and open education and gone into a paid model to get you a certificate or a mini degree. And then really the pitch of them is less now about the material that you learn and more about like, we're going to help place you into a job. Coursera a little bit less like that, but many of the others is, we're going to place you into a job. It's become this kind of like recruiter slash job placement service where the main value prop is the ins that you have at many companies and sort of what kind of network you have to place grads into positions for hire than it is about actually learning something, which maybe that's what most people are looking for overall. But education, I think, still has a very, very long way to go until we can comfortably fully transition to all online. And I think as more and more people are, needing to go through dealing with online education, the more that's going to be seen. But hopefully that's a catalyst for really positive change.
Yeah, I hope so too. Especially if it doesn't happen now, it's hard to see that it's ever going to happen, right? Because now we're
Yeah.
sort of forced into this situation, or a lot of people are forced into this um, course of action. And also, I suppose like a lot of things are gonna actually depend on how long the lockdown lasts. Obviously, the longer it lasts, the more severe or the more pronounced the effects on or the changes are gonna be. Um, but speaking of poker, we didn't really touch upon that yet, but it's clear, at least a lot of people share the opinion that currently online poker is booming. I mean, obviously the numbers are supporting that. We have the biggest prize pools in the tournaments. Cash games seem to be, quite busy. Have you thought about what kind of effect COVID could have on poker in the short and long term, and um, what are your thoughts on
So
that?
yeah, I I haven't really thought about the poker industry a ton in a long time. So this is like the first time that I guess I'm sitting and thinking about some of the sort of, yeah, I've talked about it a lot, that I really have only focused on like the stats of the disease and the immediate first order effects rather than maybe some of the second order or sort of further down effects on
Mm-hmm.
certain industries. And so, you know, I really don't have a firm grasp of what this is going to feel like to society as a whole. And I think there's a couple things that influence that. And it's one, what happens from here? Are we going to reopen countries in a couple weeks? I mean, certainly some countries are. They're not going to sustain staying closed forever. So are we going to reopen? And if we do, are we going to be, like South Korea, who's reopened and done amazing? Or are we just going to train wreck into another thing, right? Are people going to stay socially distanced? Are they going to wear masks? Are they going to do all of these things? So I think that comes into is like, how long of quarantine do we have? And when we go back, do we beat it? And are we successful? If so, people are probably going to be pretty comfortable in most things that they were doing before. Whereas if we go back and we just get totally wrecked again, or if we have a second wave this fall and we don't seem prepared for it and we just get totally wrecked, like those are things I think where those sort of situations are going to influence people's behaviors long term much more than we reopen the countries, everybody wears a mask, and like, oh, no problem, life is normal, vaccine in 12 to 18 months, and everything's all good, right? Then I think everyone, like, the thing that changes is you wear something on your face and everything else is more or less the same, versus like, okay, we made it through, we all quarantined, great. We're going to reopen the countries. Everybody stay safe. Do your own thing. Nobody's wearing a mask. Everybody goes out, and then we have another like couple 100,000 deaths or something, and we need to re-lock down everything again. Then I think it's very different, where everybody's like, oh my god, everything is a risk factor. Now we've been away from casinos and from other elements for a very long time. So if that happens, and sort of human nature changes quite drastically away from the in person in places that they don't have to be, um, then yeah, I mean, I'm sure that will be amazing for online poker, and for anything online in general. But the downside being that if we enter a massive recession because we have all of all of these things closed for a very long time, like that just can't be good for poker. It never has been in the past. Yeah. So I think that's the other thing is like if countries stay closed right now, people maybe are a little bit worried, but we see unemployment spiking, all of that, but people haven't gone through like not being able to work for months at a time and what impact that's going to have. Like people are going to tighten up their belts, like um, things are going to get a lot different, I guess, in terms of where money gets spent if we go into a true kind of crazy recession. So I think everybody's hoping that that's not the case. Huge negative impacts to a lot of people, if that happens. But I guess I would also just be weighing it. I would be weighing people doing more things online versus the average person just having much fewer discretionary spending. But right now, I've heard games are amazing, and everybody seems to be saying it's
Yeah.
pretty awesome right now. So
Yeah, it is. But I think the key word is right now, right? Because whenever somebody's telling me, "Oh, you know what, poker is booming. This is just a great industry. We're so lucky." I'm thinking, well, yes. So go ahead and play as much as you can right now because right now it's great. But as you said, if it hits like a big recession, it's hard to see how poker is going to be immune to, like, all the other businesses are suffering and all of a sudden poker is still booming. It's just not going to happen. And in fact, I see that there's a huge increase in the volume or the number of players playing in the mid stakes and especially the low stakes. It doesn't necessarily translate to the high stakes immediately, even in the short term, right? And in fact, I think high stakes are going to be the first to suffer the consequences a bit, because if we think about the kind of people who play the 10K plus games, they usually are quite busy businessmen, and it's hard to see unless they are in pharmaceuticals or some other industries that might be doing quite all right. They're probably, like, their business is suffering. There's no way they're going to keep playing. They have other things to focus on, and probably they're feeling already the pain of losing a lot of money just from their business. So, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think it kind of depends on. I think there's two kinds of people who kind of play those games, and I think the same thing. It's same as everybody. Low stakes, high stakes. Like there's the guys who really have a ton of money and just play because they love it, and then there's another cohort of people who are like kind of people have kind of a problem with gambling or have like an addiction to maybe this feeling of wanting to win, whatever it is, whatever it drives people to gamble. I can see that absolutely being exacerbated by being inside all the time and having access to online. Like it takes, I'll say the person who's a very bad gambler, like typically lacks quite a bit of discipline. And I think it's hard to stay disciplined when you have constant access to these things. So I've seen plenty of people from friends to kind of extended family have sort of issues with these things, and I think if you have again constant access, so if somebody's quarantined online and they sort of like have this problem, I think there's like that other side of it where it's kind of tough to stop yourself until it gets pretty bad. And so yeah, I don't know. I do think the average intelligent businessman who plays for fun or plays socially or plays out of this bit of competition, like yeah, their business suffers. They'll cut back on things like that seem splurgy before. But I do also think there's sort of the element of people who who maybe had less time before to do it, and so they only did it maybe once in a great while. Now having persistent, constant access to it, being kind of this revolving door in high stakes. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. There's more than one side to this. There's definitely going to be some people dropping out, some people coming in, and it applies to all stakes, I suppose. So yeah, it remains to be seen. But one thing that is clear that if we look at people in a lot of conventional careers, a lot of people are starting to get a bit anxious about the security of their jobs, start trying to think of, well, actually just rethinking their original idea of how secure their lives and their income is in many ways. I suppose some poker players might also start doing that pretty soon, right? When you realize that, yeah, because some people are going to be in a situation where they are a professional poker player, but let's say the family has more than one source of income. So it's not only their income. Let's say their spouse is also an earner. And if the spouse is no longer bringing in any income, you're in a kind of a tricky spot, especially if you're not already like a high stakes player who's sitting on a bunch of savings and doesn't really feel the pressure of having to provide the monthly income. All of a sudden, if you come to that situation, being a professional poker player seems quite a bit risky, right? When you're actually depending on, all this extra pressure of I have to bring in the paycheck every month. But what I'm getting at is that, a lot of people are rethinking how can they stay relevant, how can they change, how can they, change their careers. And your example of you've started investing in other businesses and you've started diversifying and started being interested in other opportunities while still playing poker at the high level and still being very much a full-time professional. So can you tell me a bit about that? Like, how did you start diversifying? Was it always an interest of yours, or what's the story there?
Yeah, so it was a bit of a mixture. I'll say mine was, largely I just kind of am eclectically drawn to things that I find interesting. I'm very known to just like dive into things. So, I started my first company right out of school. It's like a web and mobile development company. Fine. So it worked. I went to school for computer science. So it was like as I was in school basically, and then dropped out of school after 3 years to move to France with my wife. Started playing poker professionally. Great. Moved back to the States. Was playing full time there. And basically Black Friday happened. So we had just bought a house. Literally, like I think we signed on it a month before Black Friday. So all income's gone, all of that, and I had to figure out, all right, like what am I going to do? So the first thing I thought about is, well, what's actually happening in the market right now? Like what is happening in our industry? And everybody in the States, all these high stakes players who I knew were all scrambling to find places to play. So the first thing I did is started an affiliate site basically and signed up all my friends to places they could play from the States. And so that was like within 2 weeks, I was making like 30K a month from that. So like, oh, great. That's a great start. That's like buys me as a stopgap. But then I sort of dug into just marketing in general and the affiliate side of things much deeper. And there was this company starting this daily fantasy sports site, BuzzDraft. And I said, listen, I got introduced for some friends that were raising some money. And I said, let me come, and you'll see this has been a persistent trend of mine. I don't think I've actually taken an income from a single business in like 10 years or something. But I said, come, let me work for you for free, basically. And basically just learn more about this. Let me see what I can do, basically. And like 3 months after that, they made me chief of marketing, and 3 months after that, the board made me CEO, and then we raised money, and then we launched, and then we ended up selling that in like 2013. So I took a stopgap from poker basically in that period, and then in between that, I went back to playing poker. So we we sold our house, moved to Vancouver, started playing poker again, had my first kid. Ended up getting into Twitch streaming and really, really loving that. And then we planned like a 1-year trip around the world. So took that stopgap again, stopped streaming, stopped playing poker, traveled around the world. As I was doing that, I'm like, you know what? I haven't programmed in a long time. Like, I want to do something with programming. Like, this will be something I can just learn as I go. Started digging into machine learning, ended up making a model for baseball. Basically, I hated baseball, dumb sport, never liked it, but had really great stats. And so I said, okay, for machine learning, like this is going to be pretty good. We have this huge wealth of data, and so I just started putting together this massive database. of basically every baseball game that's ever been played, all of these stats about it, my own sort of layer of stats on top of that. And I talked to it about a friend that I was building. I told a friend basically I was building it, and he introduced me to this guy Joel Moxley from Row AI. So had a meeting with Joel, and Joel and the Row AI guys had been like, everyone knows kind of MIT blackjack team, but they had been an MIT baseball hedge fund that they had started. Um, and basically they took $500 to $500,000 in like a matter of a couple of months right before UIEGA. So it stopped. They all finished their PhDs at MIT and like went off into normal life. But anyway, showed it to Joel. He had this guy Eric validate it and basically go through. And he said, "Listen, this is the most comprehensive, basically the best data set I've ever seen for baseball." The very next day, I was on a phone with Billy Bean, who's the GM of the Oakland A's, a guy from Moneyball, on the phone with Farhan from the Dodgers. So I talked to a bunch of GMs in baseball and eventually ended up selling that to a baseball team, sort of in collaboration with Row AI. So did that, got a position at Row AI as like an entrepreneur in residence. Started sort of crypto came along, and I had been mining and involved back in like 2013 2014, but end of 2016 I was pretty convinced that like now was a moment, and so I moved over like a pretty decent portion of my net worth into crypto. um, did some of that, basically started a company in the space with one of the first ever engineering hire at Andreessen Horowitz, a couple other guys. So started a company there, which has now pivoted to Hero AI. So started that company that's out in the Valley, started a research company here. And I think that's pretty much it. Um, yeah, something along those lines of that path. So really, I just kept finding something. Originally it was poker for sure, and then it was daily fantasy, and then it was crypto. Well, then I guess it was AI first, and then it was crypto. And I just like every 2 to 3 years, I find something that's interesting. I throw myself at it 100%, just super dive deep. Poker's always been a stopgap in between everything else that I'm doing. So again, every time I sold a business or did something, I would go back and play for a year or two until I found kind of something else that I wanted to do. Um, but yeah, I mean, I just love to immerse myself in something new, and it's a curse too because I don't seem to stay with one thing for a super long time. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I've loved it. I found it super interesting. I get to learn a ton of new things, get good at a ton of different things, and I think the biggest thing is just like I've always been willing to throw myself 100% into something. Again, most of these things I like never drew salary, wanted as much equity as I could. I just wanted to be fully invested, not thinking about grinding out a paycheck, not thinking about anything. And I think that mentality has enabled me to like considering where I came from, my network is pretty awesome. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just allowed me to work with really awesome people. I've done some stuff with some really amazing people with incredible backgrounds. And so yeah, I think that's been a huge boon, is just like constantly having that mentality.
Wow. Man, so many questions I have in my mind that I want to ask you about this because it is fascinating, and especially the aspects of the way you dive in. That, like you said, you're not there to grind out the paycheck. You're there fully immersing yourself and then seeing what happens. And well, by the looks of it, mostly good things happened. So that's great to hear. One thing you completely glossed over, though, you've just briefly mentioned, well, I had a kid and then we went for a 1 year trip around the world. Did you actually go on a 1 year trip around the world with your kid?
Yeah. When
This
my
is
kid
crazy.
turned 1.5, we liked Vancouver, but we weren't totally sure that we were gonna stay here. And so this was off the back of I just had my best year ever in poker, EV wise, not dollar wise, but I had like close to a $1 million EV year in poker. And so I felt really good, playing great. Basically, it felt like I was crushing. But one thing I've always hated about poker is basically the like waiting around for action. I could never play cash. I went very early on. I knew jungle. I like got coaching from jungle early on. Got coaching from some of these awesome guys in cash, and then I played for like a week, and I just sat every single person who played like 10, 20 or lower, and every single one, or like 99%, just sat out. Like it was impossible to get action. It was possible to do anything. And so I always hated that element. And in poker, like the better you got, the harder it was to get action, which is natural. It's like the obvious reaction, but it was ungodly boring for me. And so on the back of that, I started a Twitch stream for a couple months, but then we decided Twitch stream went great. That was going really well, super fun. I think we were getting like up to back then there weren't a ton of viewers at the time, but we were getting 2K plus viewers at a time for like a month or two in. So it felt like I could have turned into something. But we decided like, listen, not sure if we want to stay in Vancouver. Been doing well at everything. Might as well like throw life to the wind and try something new. So I don't know why I make those decisions, but that's what we did. Packed up, took the kid, started in Iceland. We did Iceland, France, Switzerland, Portugal, Montreal, went to New Hampshire as a stopgap with my family, San Diego, Australia, Thailand, Korea, Japan. So 11 countries in 12 months, basically. We did we didn't buy tickets ahead of time. We would book an Airbnb for like basically a month at a time. We tried to live in each place kind of how we would live there. Like the goal was is there a place we would rather live than Vancouver long term, a place we want to raise our kids? So we tried to like go through normal life there. My kid, between the age of like 1.5 to 2.5, went to like Montessori schools in 7 different countries. So languages he didn't speak. Like it was super awesome. I think it was amazing for him. Huge amount of like growth and ability to just like be adaptable. He'd been on like 60 flights or something. I think it was amazing for him. It was amazing for us. But so yeah, we would just, if we liked a place, we'd stay longer. If we didn't, we'd buy tickets and go. And so, yeah, we did that for 1 year, came back, almost moved to Melbourne, Australia. Was moving to Melbourne, Australia, but then my wife decided she wanted to try to start a business here, and our kid got into, I'll say like, I guess one of the best private schools in the area. And so when he got into that school, and she wanted to do that, we decided we'll end up staying here, and we've been happy. So that was 2 years ago, basically, that we decided not to go to Melbourne. Melbourne and Lisbon, of all the places we went, were like the two that we really strongly considered. But I think we're here pretty long term now.
So what did you like about Melbourne and Lisbon?
Yes, both very similar to Vancouver in terms of like being green, like pretty easy access to like nature, extremely walkable cities. I think that ranks very highly for me. In any city is one thing I hate about living in the US is everything is like very strip mall-y. Everything is set aside. When we're living in Austin, you're going to be in the car 30 minutes to go anywhere, 30 minutes back. You're spending hours of your day. Like I'm at the computer all day, every day, no matter what. And so the difference of like having an extra 2 hours of being lethargic to do anything versus like going out and like walking along the ocean or along the seawall or walking to get anything is just like the difference of that 1 hour outside walking versus in a car just makes a huge impact on quality of life. So, in both of those places, quality of life is extremely high. Very walkable cities, very green, access to parks, everything. Like those are the major things for us is just being able to be outside, easy, good climate, pretty moderate. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I like both of these cities as well a lot. Not sure if I would want to move there. Well, Melbourne is really nice, and Lisbon is really nice. I totally see why you like them, and well, I guess it's good for you that you stayed where you are, with the business for your wife and the school for the kid, really important. One thing that I want to get back to, though, is you've said you had a 1 million EV year, you were bored, and you thought it's a great idea to go for a round-the-world trip. A lot of people, after they have their best year ever, in EV or otherwise, they feel compelled to keep playing because you sort of build yourself a pressure of, well, I'm crushing, so I better keep crushing. All right. In your case, it was a completely opposite decision. Do you think, like, what did this year teach you or help you with? Because I hear several people did the same thing, basically taking a big break when they're, probably at the peak of their career, and then they found an even bigger peak after that, or they found a completely different direction in which they apply themselves. How much did this 1 year trip influence where your life headed after that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it influenced it quite a bit. The trip for sure. I think the big thing was, so my sort of like year that I had was well documented. I had this thread on 2+2,
Mm-hmm.
where it was like coming back to poker basically after a very long time. It's a pretty ridiculous name. It's like Primordial AA is like glorious return. It has something like that basically. But I've been a long way. I used to be pretty involved in the poker community. Came back, documented all of my EV sessions for all the basically for most of that year. I think I stopped maybe 2/3 of the year through. Um, but uh but yeah, so came back, was this huge positive feedback loop of like crushing, doing really well, the community like being really excited about it, huge number of views on that thread, and just like, yeah, I don't know, it was fun, it was awesome, it was very motivating. Same thing with the Twitch stream, like that. Same, I was talking about social media earlier. It's a huge amount of like dopamine that you get from that thing. That's
Mm.
why it's why people do that. Whereas you take the opposite approach, right? You and many others of the maybe lesser known personally take the maximize profits approach, which is probably the much smarter approach to take. But I was just drawn to it. I was always drawn to yeah, I guess I was sort of always drawn to like that element of like social engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in terms of poker, I just my love of the game started dying throughout that year. I met somebody here who helped me a ton in terms of like getting better at poker and really changed the way that I think about poker. Um, so I felt like I was getting much better. But again, one thing about me, so most people when they play poker, they get like, I had a ton of friends playing heads up singles, like they would get to a level where they're making 50K in a year, 100K in a year, and they're like, this is a great living. They would stop, they wouldn't move up anymore, they would just grind that, and then eventually they'd like fade into obsoleteness and be done. But they grinded out a great living for a while. Whereas like me, I never really focused on profits ever. I wanted, like, always wanted to play somebody better. I was always taking shots. I was always trying to play people who were better than me. I was always had this huge propensity for war when most other people did not. Like, I loved the competition. I wanted to prove myself. I loved that element of it. And once you get more established, like heads up singles at the top is just like everybody shares, and you just sit. It went from like this really engaging thing where you'd have these super long wars. You're playing a ton of table, and you're just trying to outsmart the other guy. You're trying to basically become better, find ways to mitigate how he's exploiting you, and it was just fascinating thing to me. And it came to just like, you sit around all day, you get like 4 games an hour, and you just wait for very bad players to like make mistakes. Like, it's no longer about you doing anything like super exceptional or like using your brain a ton. I guess there is some element like exploitation, but a lot of it was just like you're just waiting around for these people to just make like egregious mistakes. And it went from being what I found to be like fascinating work to being like extremely menial labor. I didn't like it. I didn't find it to be engaging at all. I didn't find it to be super mentally stimulating. Yeah, I started to fade. I started to hate what I was doing. I started to not love the game at all anymore. And I think it's hard to stay in any sort of competitive level, especially with the space that poker moves, like the pace that poker moves at, in terms of like, a lot of people who are really young and hungry. I've seen it a million times where basically, guys come up, and back in the day, like, a lot of us kind of at the time, older grinders were hitting, 24, 25, and you had these young, like 18-year-old kids just coming up and just studying a ton and be willing to war and just a lot of them became like really successful, but it's like that mindset. You really need to be in it. You need to study. You need to be really on top of your game, and have the capacity to learn, adapt, and war. And basically, the less that I enjoyed the game, the less that I wanted to do those things, and it like just wasn't tenable anymore. So yeah, I mean, basically that. I started to lose my love of the game.
Mm.
I started doing that Twitch stream, and again, that sort of like revitalized me a little bit. I was streaming spin and goes, so I like wasn't playing them off the stream. I was still playing all my normal games, but on stream I was playing spins. It was kind of like a new game. It was fun, enjoyable. It was cool to grow the audience and get back into kind of the maybe marketing slash education route. I was, I think, one of the earliest people making videos too. I made like 60 videos for all these different sites. So I was loved teaching. I always loved that element of it. So the Twitch stream I did really enjoy. I actually intended to keep doing that. But it was just too hard as I was traveling. I just, switching to all these different time zones. I couldn't stay in a consistent schedule. And by the time I came back, I was really into AI. I was just diving into crypto, and it was just like there wasn't a time, there wasn't a period for me to like break back into it. It just, I don't know.
Mm.
I didn't have it anymore. I didn't have the love for it anymore.
All right. Well, I mean, once you find something else that you're absolutely enjoying, what's the point of sort of dwelling on what you used to do before, right? But one thing you've mentioned, and I want to ask you more about it. You've said, so you've met somebody who basically changed the way you see poker, right? As you described. Do you remember what it was for you? Like, what was the big eye-opening moment there?
Really, it was just the way they thought about the game. So the first person, I guess there's like, so the way I got into Heads Up in the very beginning was like I played all on my own completely until college. I didn't read like no resources, no online, nothing. I was just grinding, just figuring things out. And then I saw some post on 2+2 of some guy bragging about having like coached and staked some guy, and then after that he was just crushing. And so randomly on a total whim, was pretty out of character for me, to be honest. I signed up to the site 2+2, and like I messaged this guy like, hey, would you consider doing that with me? Like, and so he said yes. He's again a guy, very very large ego, loved to kind of do that and be public about it. So it was awesome. He bought me a coach. He staked me, and I started started playing Heads Up for the first time. And then I got really immersed in 2+2. That was great. But that was like the first catalyst, was like learning about the 2+2 mindset. This coach had been really into 2+2, and just learning about the way that people studied and do things there. That was my first really big catalyst, I guess. My second was when I worked with Jungle and talking to Jungle. Like the first time I heard Jungle think through a hand, reviewing a hand, it just like completely blew my mind. Back then we were still, you were thinking kind of about ranges and like the way that people do things. But Jungle was like out of nowhere, before I heard anybody doing that, he's like, just running full numbers. He's like, oh yeah, and like at the end of the hand in this spot, he's got like 6% of his range that's weighted in this way, and so I just like make this absurd call, right? And it's just the way that he thought through and analyzed in game, really changed the way I thought about things a lot back then. And the next was sort of like an extension of that. But again, it was just the way, this person is somebody who like crushed fish. Actually, he was um, really good at warring people, but never wanted to do it. He was the person who's totally unknown, but made just a ton of money, printed money every month. It was the highest EV I'd ever seen anybody have in terms of EV ROI playing fish, or just in general. Like he just crushed. And he ended up becoming like one of my best friends here, and like we just spent all of this time, and it just changed the way that I thought about both how to approach poker as like as being a poker player, in terms of like my ambitions had always been like try to be the very best, play all of the very best, everything else will follow. And his was just like study, try to figure out how to actually be the very best at playing, but don't care about anything else, don't care about recognition, just care about like just maximizing dollars earned. And he was extremely extremely good about it. So yeah, I think those were like the three, and the initial thought was, okay, 2 plus 2 was like less of just being kind of just clicky monkey back in like 2006 or something.
Right. Sorry about that, guys. I had a power cut. Not only me, apparently, like the whole area was with no electricity for a while, which is just funny because exactly the same thing happened on the Galfon stream yesterday. I was joining David Tuckman for commentary yesterday, and same thing happened to him, and then nobody knows what's going on. He's gone for 10-15 minutes, no messages, so you know. These things, it's just the beginning, guys. It happened to him while he's in LA. Now it's happening to me in Malta. The world's going to shit. Oh well. Anyway, while I was running around like a headless chicken trying to figure out how to get electricity back on, obviously I couldn't do anything about it. Where were we? Do you remember?
I don't remember. I think we're talking about. Leaving poker after having one of my best years, but I think we pretty
Yeah,
much had just wrapped
yeah,
that up.
yeah, yeah. And the final thing we were talking about was probably about how you saw how different the thought process was of guys like Jungle Man,
That's
and,
right.
and that, because I think that is one of the things that is always fascinating to me, because everybody that I know at some point had a moment of like this big aha when they sort of saw another guy think from a completely different perspective, and then they would be like, wow, this is incredible. So I remember even like on our conversation with Fedor Holtz, he was saying that obviously he was at the time already pretty good player himself, very good player, and Stefan Sotenmeier, um, he is a great guy as well, and they had such complete different approaches to how they view the game, and it was combining the two approaches was a great thing. Anyway, let's not get bogged down on this, because I still am really curious about your deep dive into AI, especially the way you described it. You said like, well, okay, I've studied computer sciences, and I was fascinated about the AI, so I thought, why not go into baseball? But hey, I hate baseball. Right, so how did that happen? I mean, I understand there's a lot of data and stuff, but still, there were probably other choices apart from baseball. Why baseball?
Yeah. So I think the big thing was basically I just sold my daily fantasy sports site, and I watched all of kind of the top DFS players were making millions per year, and really most of them were doing it fairly subjectively. Like there were just guys who knew sports and loved sports, but there was not a huge amount of sophisticated modeling out there yet. And so I originally thought like, oh well, if I can sort of solve some of these sports, it would give me a huge edge from like a player perspective. So I originally did it with that in mind in terms of like, okay, let's try to make a model that's good enough to like beat DFS. And that just pivoted basically as I was putting together that data set, talking to the actual pro MLB teams and going down that path instead. So really, it could have done anything in terms of AI. Could have focused on anything, but I had just sold that DFS company, and so that was just sort of like top of mind. It was a problem I understood. I knew where to get the data. I knew sort of how current people in that market were approaching things, and thought like, okay, let's try to make something that's better. So it was more of like an iterative step and something that I kind of already knew quite well.
Hmm. And did you just create the whole thing on your own, or you had a team assembled, or how did it go? How
No,
did
it
it
was, it
happen?
was just me.
Just
So, I
you.
mean, as I was traveling, I started to, again, it was a way for me to like relearn coding. So I started to just to deal with, all right, I have this huge amount of data out there of like every baseball game in history. Like, let's start parsing that into a database. Let's start like working on making this database efficient. Now we have like, hundreds of billions of rows. Like, how are we going to deal with, it's too long to do anything. Especially if you were going to do something like, eventually we were doing things for games that would basically be real time. And so, I just had to started digging through these efficiency problems. Then it's like, okay, well, we have all of the base stats, but most people aren't just looking at base stats. So I went to like Baseball Reference and I started reconstructing like all of the advanced stats that they have, and then I started trying to layer on my own things that I found were interesting. Then started testing them, like, okay, which of these are actually meaningful in projecting like any kind of performance or forward facing. And eventually, the problem that I actually ended up solving for the baseball teams was so you have a pitcher, and he's sort of throwing the ball. When you throw the ball, you have maybe 50 elements of pitch effects data. So you have like the speed, the spin, the rotation, the angle, the curve, the break, the release point, here, the point it hits the pitcher's glove. So you have all of these, different variables off of a single pitch. And basically, we were trying to project when that pitcher's performance would start to fall off, and then you weight that. So, you might see maybe his release point starts dropping, or his spin, the RPMs gets a little bit less, or all these things are happening. And then you sort of weight that like, okay, his performance is starting to drop off. And you have to weigh it against how good he is with degraded performance against the people who are still in the bullpen. And then weight that also against like, okay, well, if you have to pull him out super early because he's falling off, like, you're going to use up a bunch of your bullpen, and then your next couple games you're going to have a really weak bullpen for. So you had to like not just think about that one game and the immediate decision, but you had to weigh like how much his performance is falling off, what that earns you in the game right now, what it costs you in terms of bullpen, and what that is weighted against, your next upcoming couple games will the bullpen and the original pitcher rest, and you try to maximize for wins. So that was sort of like the general problem that we were trying to solve. But yeah, so originally I was just put together a huge data set, start to solve how well people will do. And then once we started talking to the actual baseball teams, we sort of honed in on a specific problem within that to solve that they had.
Right. But when you set out to do it, because like the original motivation was I want to get back into programming, right?
Yep.
When you set out to do it and play around with this huge data set, did you have in mind that you might create a business out of it? Or was it just purely, I just want to do it for fun?
I mean, I had in mind that I would try to make something that was good enough to beat daily fantasy sports. So I planned on putting money into it and trying to sort of beat the game that way.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a couple other guys, like Sahel Sud was kind of the most famous one at the time, who was an ex data scientist, and he was making like $7 to $10 million a year or something. He was just crushing back then. So he was like one of the first ones to really do it, and knowing, his background like wasn't in pure AI, it was just strictly in data science. It was pretty fascinating to see. And so, it's fun to just program in isolation. I'm a big fan of just algorithms. I'm constantly, I'm the kind of person who, for fun, recently I took like a Calc 3 class for fun, multivariate calculus. I do algorithms, regularly just for fun to try to solve them. I try to, learn these different things better. So
Mm-hmm.
I love the challenge of that, but I'm also a fan of like being pretty pragmatic and trying to have application as well. So I didn't want to just make something. I figured find something real world that if you do get good enough to make, you'll get some payoff from, and then try to do that, right? So I set a goal originally of that, and then it was like, okay, how do I acquire all of these skills? How do I go through learning each of these things? How do I put it together? How do I get it into a functioning system? And then I just, every step of the way was just like, I know my goal. I've broken it down into like these components that I need to sort of accomplish or do. And then I would just learn them one at a time and just try to do it and piece it together.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. I'm curious, what do you think poker taught you? Or like what experience did you gain from poker that you see as really valuable for you in your other businesses that you're doing right now?
Yeah, I feel like I had a better answer a couple years ago when I was kind of closer to poker than I am now. I felt like it was just more front of mind. So I'm sort
Mm-hmm.
of trying to recall, like, now everything blurs. Now it's more of just like, oh, I have all these skills from my past. I'm not sure kind of what comes from where, but I think originally, well, I mean, risk analysis for sure is one. And in the same way with coronavirus, like being able to think, and not more than just think, being able to like act in uncertain information, and with high elements of risk, and evaluate risk, and even just look at things like anybody who's played poker to use like a basic EV calculation, like just trying to apply that to spots in life, like thinking through the different decisions you could make and putting it together, I think is that kind of stuff that's basic to every poker player. I still think it adds a huge amount of advantage over regular society. Probabilistic thinking is huge. Um, certainly the ability to not many people in life go through like a true deep dive, right? So any of us who have made it in poker at any point in time to being anywhere near the top, like to get to top 100, top 50, top 10 in the world or something. It's not easy, especially in a crowded market. Like that's something that I was 70 hours a week for like a huge portion of my life. There was no period. I remember the first time ever that I had taken 3 consecutive days off from poker was when I went on a vacation to Costa Rica and we didn't have internet there. We couldn't get it. So I literally couldn't play. And it was the first time, not at my brother's wedding in St. Lucia, not like any of these times. I would be like playing poker just constantly. There was never a time that I was away from it. There was never a time I wasn't thinking about it. And so the ability to just like truly immerse yourself in something, and not just like, people semi immerse themselves, or they're doing other things and they have a job and they'll go home and they'll read on a subject or they'll be kind of fascinated in it. But I'm talking like every waking moment, that's what you think about. Like, I think that is one of the most important things that I drew from my experience in poker is not only, I often will reference like it taught me how to learn things. It taught me, when you're learning a new skill, how to break down, how to actually learn that, walking through infinite hand histories, walking through just all of these things in terms of like study, application, the mix of the two, sort of interfacing with other people who are like top in the field. Like all of these things are things that you have to do kind of regularly in poker. Um, in terms of like trying to acquire those new skills, trying to figure out where you were going wrong and analyze. So all of those skills for sure. But more than anything, I think it was just like having gone through a really deep dive. And I actually think what let me do that in poker is prior to that, I was very, very competitive at wrestling. I wrestled for like 10 years, wrestled in college, all over the country. I worked out 3 hours a day, 6+ days a week, every day for almost 10 years. I was like 4% body fat. So just I had gone through this huge amount of like knowing what it is to be disciplined in something, and I wasn't disciplined in a lot of areas in poker for sure. I am not like the sort of person you should look to for discipline in that way, but um, just knowing what it is to put in work and effort day in day out for years at a time, and then taking that into poker and just like diving in. I think those are kind of the most important things that have carried through is just yeah, just being able to be obsessed with something and know that it's possible, right? I think most people don't think it's possible to get to a certain level in things. Most people that I talk to about any field, they're just talking about, people told me that in AI, people told me that in everything, like, more or less impossible. There's just no way to become good at this thing relative to other people in the field. Um, and I just have always completely disagreed with that. I've always taken the stance that I think most people are pretty bad at most things. Like generally, I've a lot of people that I've seen in pretty high positions, I'm just not super impressed with. I think most people are inherently lazy. I think, like I don't think anybody is just, I think hard work can make up for a lot of things. And I think that if you're willing to put in a huge amount of effort, I think most people, like, I don't think myself or most people that I see, certainly not a lot of the poker players are, maybe they have inclinations in certain ways, or they're sort of like better at some things than other people, but I don't think they're just magically like unbelievably gifted. I don't think there's any reason that I was better suited, maybe better suited, but there's nothing that makes it so somebody else couldn't have gotten good at something I got in. There's nothing that made it so I couldn't get good at something else. So I think almost all skills are learnable. I think with enough like dedication and hard work, basically any field you can become very, very good at, even pretty quickly, like within a year. And so I think with that kind of mindset, I think the biggest thing is just the ability to do that, to put in work day after day, nonstop, and just drive yourself to something. I really think that people underestimate how good you can get at something, and really just how most fields are inherently incentivized to make it seem like everything is impossible, or like it's so hard, right? That's their moat. They don't want their boss or to their competitors or anyone else to make it seem like it's so easy, or that most people just aren't that special. But at the end of the day, most people aren't that special. Really, it's these other things in terms of like knowing how to spend your time and how to apply your time learning something and putting it into practice, and the ability to really drive through it. I think you can get very good at almost anything, if you can just do that. So I think that's my most important takeaway.
Hmm. Oh, I completely agree with how important it is, and basically on every point in this, I agree with you. And clearly, obviously, it's also part of your personality, because as you said, you've been hardworking in the wrestling uh, field. Let's put it this way: when you were young, and it translates to everything else that you do. But also, we talked about earlier about Coursera, Udemy, and all the other sites, which sort of focus on the certificate, right? At least some of them really seem to do put the certificate first, as it seems like something that people actually want to get. And it's also kind of ingrained in some of us to think that, okay, to achieve something, you have to have the credentials, you have to have the certificate, you have to have the tick here and there, and you sort of, here's the path, and you take one step at a time on the ladder. So to believe in yourself that you can just do it yourself with hard work, and nothing beats hard work, it's such a great advice, and I completely agree that so many people don't see this value, don't believe that it is that it's possible. And in poker and everywhere else, I mean, especially in poker, it's so easy to see how much the hard work matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody again who spent a ton of time in poker knows that the guys who are crushing, they're putting in work and hours. It's not something. They're not the days of like, oh, there's just a natural talent, and that guy's just he's just crushing. Everybody who's good now puts in a huge amount of work. Everybody who got good or gets to the top put in a huge amount of work. And again, you know I'm there's no reason that I should be working with some of the people. Again, college dropout, spent 10 years of my life gambling, and baseball project, EIR, like all of them are MIT PhDs. Co-founder of my company, like chief technologist at like Andreessen Horowitz, possibly number one investing firm maybe in the world, definitely very, very high up there. Just published research, or soon to be published. It's submitted with like the Facebook AI research team, like extremely prestigious group. Like all of these things are, certainly nobody around me that I'm working with they're all extremely well credentialed. And I will say getting well credentialed is definitely a path to getting into those things, but it is not the only path.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, I think that's the biggest thing is I don't think that I've done anything exceptionally different than most other people. I think it's just a persistence and the ability to kind of like, I don't know. Most of those things, again, like the baseball thing, it came from, hey, what are you working on? This is what I'm working on. Oh, that seems really cool. And me just being like, I always say yes, basically. If something is interesting, I'll always say yes. Like I mentioned in the past, I worked for free on a ton of this stuff. It didn't matter. I was just fascinated with a thing, and so many opportunities have come up from that. Like I was thinking about there was a period I had thought about going back to finish my degree at school, and my guy asked me, hey, what is a person I'd worked on some of the baseball stuff with, like, what's your dream school? I was like, oh, obviously, if I was going to go back to school anywhere, I'd love to go to Stanford. And basically got an introduction next day, got an offer from the director of the super accelerator at Stanford, which is kind of like their CERN, the particle accelerator, to come work for him for 6 months. And then he'll like handwrite me a letter into Stanford. And all of this, like all of these opportunities, all of these things come from, I didn't take it. I ended up being like, I ended up not going back to school, but it's something I always wanted to do. And amazing school. I like academia in general. I like the general study of things. I don't necessarily like academics, but I do like the sort of singular focus on very hard problems. I feel like I would like grad school a lot. But just like so many of these opportunities arise just from having said yes to a million things in the past and just throwing myself at whatever I'm working on. So, and I think like the ability to do that is just finding things that you find interesting in the same way that when poker was dead to me, I in terms of like emotionally, I tried to just stop. And these other things were like, I will stop something if I don't love doing it, and I will throw myself 100% into something that I find fascinating. And I think that's really the only thing that maybe separates me is the ability to not overthink things. The example that I gave a lot when I was younger was thinking about dropping out of school. Right, I'd finished 3 years, one single year left. You know, should I drop out or should I not, basically? And the decision, most people I feel like agonize trying to make perfect decision in so many spots, but there's just very practical ways to think about it in terms of like, what is the cost? For me, if I finished school, I was already making more at poker than I would ever make at a computer science job. I knew that I wasn't going to be using my degree after I graduate. I had no need for the piece of paper. So it was like, okay, finish, make my mom happy, have a better backup. Don't finish, get to go pro in poker full time, get to move to France and be with my girlfriend who eventually became my wife. Like, don't need to be apart. And the cost was just so, it's like, okay, if I go and play poker full time for 1 year and it doesn't work out, I'm not good at it, it doesn't become a career, I can just go back and finish school. Like, that's not really a big deal to postpone that for 1 year. Whereas like the cost on the other side of like pushing back that, or it just, I guess it's so easy for me in decisions that I find other people treat very difficult or agonize over too much trying to make the best decision. I feel like it's easy for me to make just an okay decision, but fully throw myself behind it. And I guess I think that's the only real difference, is the ability to immerse myself. So if other people can do that, I honestly think pretty much everything is open, every field, nothing is that hard. There's a few exceptions. I'm sure like being a nuclear physicist is pretty hard, or at least takes a lot of catching up to do. But there are a lot of other things, or just a lot of things in general, that you can just close the gap so much faster than you think. And having closed it in a short period and being motivated will just set you so far apart of everybody else.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm so glad we touched upon this because, it's such important advice and so inspirational. I hope it's so inspirational for all of people, and because like whenever I think about the interesting stories in poker, right, if we get back to poker a bit, I'm always the most fascinated about the story of a group of people who worked around Fedor Holtz, right? Fedor, Stefan, Ben, and Dominic, and all the other guys, right? Because they all achieved incredible success in a field where the link, the immediate link between hard work and the actual results was not always obvious, right? Yet that group achieved huge success, and they attribute all of it, or most of it, to how hard they worked, right? And it's such an inspirational thing, and especially the way you put it, that anybody can do it, and which I completely agree with. And you should do it as long as you love it. That's such a key point as well, because you have to realize if you're not willing to immerse yourself anymore, if that doesn't bring you joy, you're better off doing something else. And another aspect here as well, like apart from just the hard work itself, it's so important to have the network of people to be able to tap into other minds. You described your experience of, talking to Jungle about hands and getting coaching from some people. It's such an accelerator for many people of basically a fast track to success eventually.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think in pretty much anything there are, and I've been really guilty of the other side of this. I want to try to be good at everything. I'm competitive by nature. Again, I sort of conflate the ability to get good at anything with trying to be good at everything. That's two totally different things. I think everybody has a sort of chance and ability to get good at anything. Like you can get good at anything, but you can't be good at everything. And I think having worked in businesses and sort of understanding how that functions, like you have to be able to lean on other people sometimes for their skills. You have to like the ability to draw from other people to gaining your own skills. All of this is massively important. And it's impossible to get good, to be good at everything, even if it's possible to get good at anything. And so I think that's the biggest thing is like there are other people who can massively, massively accelerate you when you're all on a singular journey. So poker is a great example of that. Everybody is working to sort of the same, everybody's working towards the same objective. And you're all studying together and you sort of draw from each other's what you learn, right? You're like aggregating knowledge together and that accelerates that. You see that in research projects a ton.
Mm-hmm.
So aggregate knowledge is like a massive thing. And then the sort of other side of that is when you're working as a team, basically, you have to be able to rely on, you have to be able to rely on other people. You're not going to be able to get good at everything in a business. You can't. You can have some surface level knowledge of everything, and you can understand it all enough to help and to direct things, but you're not going to be the person who's able to do everything, both in time and in skill. And yeah, I don't know. It's just massively important to have people around you who you hopefully have the same mindset, but basically you allow to take that path. You're going and you're getting good at one thing. You talk about, Doug Polk is a great example in poker where
Mm-hmm.
Doug is, hugely popular at what he does. Um, but it's not just him, right? He's the guys who run his business for Upswing. He's the guys who are editing videos on his channel, and there's all of these things around him. And he would just be so much worse off if he just tried to do everything himself. There's no way that you can. You have to be able to rely on other people. So find one thing you want to get good at, and when you're doing that one thing, definitely lean on other people in that thing. But don't try to overextend yourself. Don't try to get too good at too many things. I think it's a recipe for disaster for sure.
And what an important point, actually, because even if we relate back to just studying poker as such, right, there's so many aspects to studying poker. There's so many things that can be done and must be done. And in fact, there's very rarely somebody out there who is good at all of the things that need to be done. Like, I know for myself, it's definitely the case that some of the things in terms of studies that I do for my own game, I just completely hate. It's tedious. I don't like it. So I would outsource it. And that way it works great. And everybody else who I know or who I work with, everybody has a task or a thing that they definitely don't like and don't want to do it. And I think, like, if we think about the business model of poker coaching, that's one of the biggest benefits that a coaching organization can provide. Just giving people an opportunity to not only learn about all the directions they need to be digging in, but also make the synergy of the group of, somebody's going to do that work for you. Somebody's going to ask these questions for you. And it's not only in poker. I mean, every single career out there, every single thing, it basically comes back to the same things. You're better off working in a group that completes each other, a group of people who complete each other. It's so important.
Yeah, and same. I mean, the same thing in poker. It used to be a lot different. It used to be like you could get good at thinking about poker, and then you could be good at every game relative to the field, because nobody was good at thinking about poker. But the more the time progresses, like, you don't see the guys anymore who are extremely good at every single game, or they're just very rare. Most of the guys who are extremely sick at, like, the best MTT players are not the best cash game players, and vice versa, typically, right? It's just too hard to get good at everything, and as those skills refine, it's just harder and harder to do. And yes, it's partially like, before, it used to just be like the cash game players would just play cash because there was more money to be made. They actually didn't care about being the best MTT players, and maybe they had the skill to become it, or could. But these days, I feel like it's just totally different. It's a huge dedication into into a certain path, and there's only so many of those paths that you can spend time at getting good at, and the rest of the field is catching up too fast.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
don't know if you agree with that. I would actually be
I
interested
absolutely
to hear.
agree with that. Yeah, I think, and especially the point that you brought up of, if we think about the mixed game players, right? There's no way, and it's definitely the case that, they're not like, there's not one guy who's great at every single game that he plays in a mix. Let's say it's a 10-game mix. There's no way. There's 2 games that he is probably weak-ish, but he probably makes a decision of, there's a 2-3 games that I'm really crushing. There's a few that I'm doing all right, and there's 2 that I suck at. So hence I know my study priorities, but I'm not gonna miss the opportunity to jump into the game. And that also sets apart some of the more successful people in poker and elsewhere. You can't always wait till you're 100% ready before you take your chance, because, well, guess what? When you're 100% ready, most likely the train is gone. It's a bit too late. You didn't use the opportunity, you waited too long. Well, and plus, you're never going to be 100% ready. If everybody else is static, nobody else is improving, sure, you can get to a point where you're better than anybody else. But everybody else is working on their game as well. So it's just never going to happen. Yeah. Wow. Man, this was so inspiring. You know what? Really, like, your whole story, so many lessons people should take from this, and such an inspiration. The hard work, the way you approach things, the way you transition from one thing to another. I mean, there's so much to learn here, and keep up the awesome work that you're doing with exposing or bringing out the information about COVID. It's been great. For those of you who just joined recently, we actually covered the virus situation in the beginning. Yeah. Where can people find you? I'm going to obviously put all the links in the description on YouTube when we publish, but is it Twitter where you most active?
I think Twitter is the part I'm most active in. I don't do too much public facing outside of Twitter anymore. So
Right.
I would say that's the best place to find me, for sure.
Yeah, and definitely go and find him, because I've been following your daily tweets myself. It's really cool to have somebody do the the number crunching for you. It's great. Thanks for doing that. And man, once again, thank you so much for joining. It was so interesting, such an inspirational story, and thank you for your time. Yeah, and guys, this episode is gonna end up on YouTube in about a week and a half. We're gonna have all the links and everything in the description, so make sure to check it out.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and loved all of our casting, and glad I could come on.
Oh yeah, and you're gonna be
again.
doing the commentary tomorrow on the Galfond Challenge, right?
Yeah, I'll be doing Galfond commentary tomorrow, and I'll be playing in the Galfond charity stream on Saturday. So probably pretty rusty these days, but hopefully I can make it through a round or two and show off some old heads-up skills.
So yeah, guys, definitely go tune in the Galfond Challenge tomorrow, as Bryan is going to be joining. You're going to be doing it together with David, right?
Tuckman, I think.
Tuckman, yeah. So this is going to be fun. You guys are awesome. And plus, what a point at the challenge. There's only like 2,500 hands left and they're almost break even. So go check it out tomorrow. We're almost at the finish line there. And yeah, the charity stream as well on Saturday is going to be a lot of fun. If you guys haven't heard about it, go check it out. I'm not going to, there's a bunch of information you can find about it. The gist of it is there's going to be 32 people playing it, 16 pros, 16 more recreational type players. It's a charity event. And it's going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be get streamed. So go check it out. All right, Bryan, once again, thank you. And guys, I'll see you all next week. Bye.
All right. Thanks so much. Bye.